Okay. So I'm going to be talking about neuroscience and the intersection of science policy. And yeah, thank you for calling me today and having me. I think this is my second or third session with Simply Neuroscience, and it's always a pleasure to come back. Excuse me, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my experience with science policy, advocacy, and also a little bit of my work in neuroscience. Because I was told that this is a focus group discussion, that's why I want to keep my presentation very short. And I know that it's morning for in the US, but it's quite late for people in India, which is where I'm joining from. So I'll keep it short and I'll keep it open to questions and we can have like a discussion because after all, it's a discussion. So a little bit about me. I'm a recent graduate in occupational therapy. I finished my bachelor's degree. I completed my internship. Right now I'm doing a service obligation at the hospital here. At Christian Medical College, Vellore, which is where I did my undergraduate degree from. And so I'm working in a brain injury neurological rehabilitation setting where I am responsible for the treatment planning of people with stroke, traumatic injury to the brain, for example, after a road traffic accident, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathies, other types of metabolic disorders and diseases of the brain. So a lot of my work is focused on people who have neurological disorders leading to disability. My research interests and primary work has been in understanding how neuromodulation, that is non-invasive brain stimulation, using methods like transcranial magnetic stimulation, deep brain stimulation, and also other forms of neuromodulation, direct current stimulation, alternating current stimulation, have an impact on functional network connectivity across the brain and how that can be envisioned using or visualized using intracranial and non-invasive recordings through EEGs, mobile EEGs, functional MRIs. So I have some interest in that, and I also am really interested in the prospect of neurotech and brain-computer interfaces to control different types of movements and retrain movements after somebody suffers from a neurological disorder. So I have 9 publications in peer-reviewed journals, and that has kind of been like from the beginning of 2020. So I have some publications related to public health, some related to neuroscience, some related to science and technology, which I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about later. A lot of my work has been focused around advocacy, and I am a really passionate advocate for people with disabilities, especially young people with disabilities, because I work with them on a day-to-day basis. And I'll talk to you a little bit in details about my advocacy work. But till now, my advocacy has been with the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth, United Nations, World Health Organization, Euro Commonwealth, healthcare information for all. I'm sorry, I've not abbreviated. I've written it as abbreviation. I have not expanded on them. But this is what it stands for: the Healthcare Information for All, GHWN, Global Health Workforce Network, National Science Policy Network, Women in Global Health, Women Leaders for Planetary Health. So I've worked with a lot of organizations as a volunteer in various capacities, and all these organizations have taken back a lot of experience in terms of, I also worked with international health policies for a brief bit. So I was a correspondent for India, wherein through which I talked about different things like epilepsy and the intersection of global health and how epilepsy requires more, it's an and sickle cell disease and epilepsy are kind of like overlooked disorders which require better or more strengthened policies. So I talked about different things when I was a correspondent for IHP, but as you can see that all of my involvement with these different organizations have kind of shaped my experiences and my interest towards science policy and the intersection of what I would like to do in my future research career and how that translates into actual policy outcomes. And then I also run Stimulus, which is a youth-led nonprofit initiative, aims to raise awareness about the brain sciences, quite similar to Simply Neuroscience, and also foster, curiosity among young people. We have this really interesting thing called Synapse Society, where we take different topics related to neuroscience, and we encourage people from all types of interdisciplinary backgrounds to come up and join the Synapse Society and join the discussions, much similar to this one. So we have modules created for them, which we circulate to the Synapse Society members in advance, and then they are shared and we discuss. We have different discussion prompts, and we discuss on different topics and different aspects. So Synapse Society is also something that we are doing quite actively, and we have done a couple of sessions of it. All right, so can we go on to the next slide? Right, so why are we talking about neuroscience and science policy? It is important to talk about science policy if as a scientist or as a future scientist, or if you're interested in neuroscience, because and I will read this from the slide. As you can see, this is taken from somebody who has written for Society for Neuroscience. A scientific approach creates quality legislation by adding a critical filter to the analysis and by contributing to a general regard that conclusions must be backed up independently. The government plays a role in creating the conditions which are necessary for scientific progress, primarily via public funding and patterns of regulation. But scientific progress needs scientists at each step of the research pipeline that begins from data extraction or experimental data to fostering market and legal viability. So what this basically means is, so all the research that is funded by public, so if it's by the National Institutes of Health in the US, or it is by the technology, the Department of Biotechnology, or the Science and Technology Council in different countries. For example, in India's Department of Biotechnology, or the Department of Science and Technology, or the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. In the US, it's the National Institute for Health. It's for, there are different funding bodies, funding agencies. So the money that is funded to do neuroscience research comes from taxpayers' money. So it's probably from your parents' tax money, or it's from, if you're earning, it's from the tax that you pay. And so it's all utilized to fund research in different capacities. And so, you know, the government is answerable to the people. However, there's a huge lack in terms of translating, you know, the research that is carried out in the lab to the general, the taxpayer, the common public. Like, how many of your parents do you think, or how many of the taxpayers in your country do you think have an idea about what is their money being used for? What is the public funding being used for research? And how many scientists are really able to communicate with the public and engage with the public and tell the public that, okay, this is what your tax paying, your hard-earned money is being utilized for. So there is a huge translational gap, and that needs to be bridged, and that's where science communication and science policy comes in. And it is very important for scientists to be involved in the process of policy making, because they are the ones who are leading the research that gives you results, that gives you data based on which different policies are formed. And so if policymakers or legislators work separately and independently, and scientists work independently, and there are no scientists that are in policy making or legislative decision making, that becomes a huge mess, because there are experts of two different types, but there needs to be someone who can bridge the gap between both. Because legislators will know only about how the law and the policies work, and scientists will know about how the science works. So both need to go hand in hand and work hand in hand in order to derive and come to policies that are evidence informed. So just to give a very simple example, when COVID started, we were all told to wear masks, and we were all, you know, there were different mandates about lockdowns, and there were different mandates about social distancing or physical distancing, keeping a distance apart, how many masks are you supposed to wear, how are you supposed to wear masks. So that was all based on science and data and experiments, and that was ultimately changed or transformed into mandates, or if not policies as such, but transformed into rules and regulations that we were supposed to follow as citizens of different kind of countries. And that was possible because scientists, public health professionals, doctors, different healthcare professionals at different levels, and policymakers and the government and legislators worked together, and they were able to convey this information to the common public. So that is the gist of what I work in and have worked in the past and would like to work in the future. And that is something that I want to introduce you to as well through today's session. Next slide, please. So why do you need science policy in neuroscience? So neuroscience can also facilitate the comprehension of cognitive skills that are required for jobs for the future, like creativity, emotional intelligence, empathy, resilience, cognitive flexibility, executive functioning. So all of this is basically controlled by the brain. And there are researchers all around the world who study different aspects of decision making, critical thinking, executive functioning, which are really important for carrying out our day-to-day actions in day-to-day life. So all of that comes down to the gist of human behavior, right? So the brain functions, it has a physiological mechanism, it has a neurochemical mechanism, it has there's a lot of changes inside the brain physiology, the chemistry of the brain, the anatomy of the brain, and ultimately all of this is studied because you want to either understand how human behavior affects decision making, cognitive thinking, different cognitive processes, physical processes, or you want to understand how disease processes affect the brain and ultimately affect one's ability to think. So public policy interventions can focus on promoting these skills, which are not fixed, and it can be improved and enhanced. So when you look at decision making or something like neuromarketing strategies, which are really largely influenced on how people make choices, how people make decisions, and a lot of independent or a lot of intelligent marketing strategies are actually based on principles of neuroscience and decision making and cognitive science, because people try to understand how people influence what influences people's decisions, people's choices, people's behavior, and what ultimately motivates them to behave in a particular manner. And so a lot of advertisements that we see or which we find appealing, the music choices that we have, the preferences for food that we have, the preferences for clothes that we have, are all choices, or even online shopping or the social media that we browse. They're all informed based on a lot of decisions, a lot of cognitive process, a lot of cognitive thinking, and so marketing strategies and marketing analysis actually really heavily depend and rely on how people make decisions. And so when it comes to public policy interventions to protect data, whether it's something like data privacy or protect the intellectual property of organizations, or people's own privacy, right to privacy and data sharing, there is a lot of decision making that is involved over there, and a lot of policy changes that need to come up as we are transforming more and more into digitization, with machine learning algorithms and social media really rapidly advancing and collecting all our data and information. We really need to be more informed about how our information is being used, and we need stronger policies to protect us and protect our privacy. And so that's where kind of like just an example of an intervention, of an intersection between public policy and neuroscience, because you have human behavior, you have the way the brain thinks, the way we think, how we make decisions, and how that actually ultimately impacts our own day-to-day living. Other areas in which evidence from neuroscience can be utilized are in infant development. So there's a lot of researchers working on brain development, right from the time it is a single cell to the neural tube development, and how the brain develops and why people have certain congenital disorders of the brain. Adolescent brain addictions, it's a very common thing. Substance use disorders are very common, especially in adolescent and youth population. So a lot of countries are dealing with crisis related to addiction among young people. And for example, the opioid epidemic in the US and science policy of marijuana use. So a lot of these addiction related studies have a really important and direct impact on legal or legislative decisions related to substance use disorders or substance use in general. So Narcotics and Drugs Control Bureau in different countries work very closely with neuroscientists and policymakers to change and update policy related and rules and regulations and law and criminal legislature regarding substance abuse. And you have neuroeducation or neuroscientific basis of teaching and learning. For example, disorders like dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia are all specific learning disabilities which require specific attention. And so how much of attention is required, how much of attention might be beneficial for the children who have specific learning disorders, or people who have specific learning disorders. There's a lot of increasing awareness about pervasive developmental disorders, ADHD, and how those can be improved, and what laws are required for the protection of people from suffering, or not suffering, but people who are, facing these kind of challenges, is really important. And that's where neuroscience research comes in. And then there's, of course, neuro law, like criminal responsibility, juvenile justice, decision making of judges, testimony of witness, so all of the whole spectrum of it. And finally, the burden of brain disorders, which is very largely researched. All right, so next slide. Okay, so now coming to a little bit of practical aspects of how you can get started, and this is based on my personal experience. You can definitely add on to this list. So as a high school student, I'm guessing, which is the general population of this particular session. So high school students or people from college, maybe college seniors or juniors, freshmen, I don't know. So how can you get involved? So if you are just like, if neuroscience is one of your majors or one of your minors that you're pursuing at university, or you're just in high school and you're really interested in neuroscience, but you're also interested in science policy and you want to explore this area more, some of the great organizations or websites that you can look at are, so first is the International Neuroethics Contest. I'm sure you're aware of this. It's a neuroethics contest that is organized, and it has two categories. One is for the high school students and the other one is for graduate students. And I think it's done on a yearly basis. I'm not sure when the deadline is for this year. But they have an essay contest wherein they have different topics, and you can write about the intersection of neuroethics with anything in society. So it can be criminal justice, it can be related to the ethical responsibilities of using AI and machine learning, it can be regarding data privacy, and like I talked about, marketing, and how neuromarketing strategies are utilized, and how data collected from you is analyzed, especially if you're a minor. And then also the use of neurotech, for example, the use of cognitive enhancement devices like deep brain stimulation, or just surface area stimulation of the brain, which can be used as cognitive enhancers by certain people, and whether the use of such devices is ethical or not. So I was a judge 2 years in a row for neuroethics essay contest for high school students, and we got some really high quality essays. And I was really surprised that high school students can write really well, and it's really impressive. So I think you can enter from anywhere around the world, and there are two categories. One is for a scientific essay, which has to be very scientifically written, and then there's a general essay that can be more of like a general writing style, and it can convey a message. All right, then you have the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, which I have worked with in the past. It's an excellent opportunity for early career scientists, graduate students, and even undergrads. When I published with the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, I was still an undergrad, so I don't think there's like a specific limit, but it is a journal catering mostly to graduate students and early career scientists. However, they have different calls open almost every few months, and they have really interesting resources and opportunities for people who are interested in science policy. So I would encourage you to look up their website and follow them on Twitter, Instagram, and all the other social media very as soon as possible, because it's a great resource. Then you have the American Association for the Advancement of Science, that is AAAS, and then you also have the National Science Foundation. So I'm sure you've heard of them. AAAS also has a call for essays. I'm not sure if it is open right now, but they have a call for essays. So if you're someone that's interested in writing long form articles, I would definitely encourage you to look at that. Then you have the National Science Policy Network. That is another great resource to get started with science policy. Then if you are from California, or if you're from the United States, you have the California Council on Science and Technology. I'm sure that there's like a different one for each state, but CCST is quite active, and they have this fellowship as well, as far as I remember. But if you join the National Science Policy Network, or AAAS mailing lists, I think you will get to know a lot of updates regarding each of these statewide legislative policy bodies. And then you have the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth, which has a science technology interface working group, which I used to work with in the past. So there are different topics that are tackled with the through the science policy working group. So you have AI, you have one for engineers, and then you have one related to climate change and the impact of technology. And then you have one on the technology for good and the public good. So there are different working groups working on different topics. There's a lot that is happening on climate change specifically and how that impacts policy. Then you have one on clear energy and conservation of water bodies and oceans. So there are different aspects of it involved. And then you also have Research America. Research America is primarily health related, so it's mostly medical, related to the medical field and the medical sciences. So if you are somebody that's interested in healthcare, Research America is definitely something that you should check out. Yeah, next slide. All right, so again, how to get involved? You can do research internships related to the intersection of neuroscience and society. So it can be like, so for example, there are various research internships that are available by different startups that are there. There's a lot of startups that are working on exploring the impacts of neurotechnology and brain-computer interfaces and whether they are really, using legal means or privacy is maintained, and different aspects of data privacy and capturing data and data recording, and whether brain-computer interfaces or cognitive enhancement devices are really useful for people, and whether they actually give an unfair advantage to people or not. So there's a lot of startups working on that intersection. So you can look them up, and there are specific internships that are also available which explore the impact of, so for example, if you go onto the Research America website, they have a science communication and science policy internship available. I think it was available until 14 January. I think the deadline to apply was 14 January. But again, one caution would be that a lot of these are available for graduate students, because it is expected that you have advanced to a certain level in your scientific career, which is the minimum requirement for several might be as a graduate student. So if you are an undergrad or high school student, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how you can get involved, but these opportunities might be a little bit more catered toward graduate students. So in that case, don't get disheartened. What you can always do is work with company or profit-based organizations through internships. So just work with them in terms of the product or the technology that they're using that is related to neuroscience, and also put in your own impact on how, probably, by writing a blog article on, for example, how that particular product, whether it's environmentally friendly or not, whether it has an impact on climate change or not. So for just a small example of something that I did is I work with women leaders for planetary health as a digital health academy mentee. And I wanted to use my interest in neuroscience to understand, basically collate that with planetary health related topics. So for my mentorship, I basically looked at how climate change has specifically impacted the female brain, because it is again related to women leaders in planetary health. So it was only for women leaders, and I was selected as a mentee. So through my mentorship, I looked at how neurodegenerative changes inside the brain have been impacted by climate change, pollution, and how that specifically has disproportionately impacted women. And I came up with a couple of policy solutions that could be done, and that was published as a blog article on their website, and was also presented at one of the conferences that was organized by women leaders in public health, in planetary health. All right, then you have local governments and legislative bodies. For example, the California Council on Science and Technology, each state will have one. It might also be present in your city. So it's a good idea to check out whether your particular city or county or your regional body has a science policy or a legislative department. Then you can also shadow policymakers or people working in the policy sphere, just like you would shadow a doctor or like a scientist in a lab. You can very well go to different aspects. I think the White House also has an internship, but I'm not really sure how competitive the process is. I think people based in the US might be able to guide you better on that. Yeah, one note of caution is that the above can be paid or unpaid. So in case they're unpaid internships, make sure that you're incentivized adequately through recommendation letters or certificates, so that you can have this experience handy with you later on when you're applying for different science policy fellowships or things like that. Next slide. Right. So where to look for how to apply? You can look at websites. For example, there is the CCST website, the California Council on Science Technology. There's something called as Research to Policy, which also offers internships specific to different topics. And that can be also something that might be of interest to you. Then you have the NSPN Slack channel. If you are a member of the National Science Policy Network, you will be added to the Slack channel, which is a great resource for coming to know about different, because people from different backgrounds post different opportunities there. Then you have the AAAS website, and then websites according to your area of interest. So for example, if you are interested in neuroscience, Society for Neuroscience, of course, is the best resource for you to get updates regarding different neuro-related topics. Then you also have the International Neuroethics Society, which is not mentioned here, but yeah, different. But SFN, I think, would be a great place for you to start to look at different opportunities that are available. And if you're not really regular in checking their websites, I would highly recommend like following their social media pages, especially Twitter, because they're quite active on Twitter. And then you can even follow the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And if you are currently a university student, I'm pretty sure that at least in the universities in the US, for example, Northwestern, Georgetown, Columbia, UW-Madison, UC Berkeley, I think almost every university in the US has a science policy group, and in Hopkins has a science policy group that is working on that. So for example, at Northwestern, I think it's called SPOT, and then at Hopkins, there's something that's there for, I think it's the Bridge Project. Then there's one at UPenn. So yeah, for every university that is there in the US, as far as I'm aware, there are a lot of science policy working groups that are working under doing significant science communication, outreach, and policy-related work. So if you are currently at university, and if you're not yet a graduate student, but you're an undergrad, it might be a really great opportunity for you to connect and reach out to graduate students who are working in this particular area in your university. Next slide. Yeah, so how to get started and some of the streams that you can pursue. So if there's nothing at university, I think it would be a great time for you to start one at your university. And one thing that NSPN does is they give you grants. So they give you a little bit amount of money to start a chapter at your local hub or university. So you can apply for funding, you can apply for a grant to join that particular chapter. And so the NSPN also divides the country into different hubs, and then there's also an international chapter. So depending on where you are from, you can apply for a grant to start a chapter at your university, or I'm not sure if it is available for high school, but it's definitely available for universities. At your high school, you can start a science policy club if that is something that can be allowed by your high school, depending on which part of the world you are in. And you can meet, discuss different topics, weekly seminars, have discussions and clubs, like how you would run any other club at your school. So some of the streams that you can pursue as beginners would be something that is really on topic right now, is how the pandemic has affected science-related funding. Then there's also diversity, education, inclusivity initiatives, how to make the workspace or the workforce, how to make the scientific world more accessible to people of color, to people of underrepresented genders, people from different underrepresented minority communities. So that is something that is really, really important, and is definitely people from the LGBTQ plus community. Something that's really important is representation of people from different backgrounds in science who have been fundamentally underrepresented. So these are topics that you can take up and explore and see what, especially if you're interested in neuroscience, what are the different initiatives that different universities have or different scientific bodies have for neuroscience, related to neuroscience, for people from underrepresented backgrounds. And if you can do a policy analysis on how different policies work, and you can even write an article on this and send it to the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. Or if you are at a university where you have a science policy group active, you can probably send it to them and they can publish it on their website. And you never know, it might be picked up by somebody. So in the government. So that is definitely important. Talk to the local governing bodies at your particular area, wherever you're residing, and see if there can be something that they can help you with to understand the process of policy making. There are different ways in which you can contribute in terms of writing, especially if you're interested in research and writing. So there are something called as policy memos. So you can go up on the JSPG, the Journal of Science Policy and Governance website, and look at what policy memos are. And they have a lot of resources, and they have a lot of workshops that they have done in the past, which are available on their YouTube website regarding policy making, writing policy memos, writing op-ed articles. You can even write for your local newspaper or your local magazine at your university or at your school regarding something that requires a change. So it does not necessarily have to start with a national level policy. It can be something that really is required, or some changes required at your particular local level, and that's how you kind of start. And then, because I'm from India, I know that there are a lot of national funds that are given by India Bioscience. It's a great organization that gives a lot of grant funding for different aspects related to science communication and policy. Then you have the Department of Science and Technology, Department of Biotechnology, DST, DBT, and you also have Wellcome Trust. Next slide. Right. So like I said, the Journal of Science Policy and Governance and UCL currently have a call for paper on innovations in science diplomacy, structures, policy, and governance for the new decade. So as you can see, they have really good workshops planned coming up for improving science diplomacy, science policy writing workshop on diplomacy issues, inclusivity in science diplomacy, non-state actors. So they have different webinars. You can go up on their website and sign up for these things. Yeah, next slide. So this is the special issue that I contributed to, which is the impact of emerging technologies on inequality and sustainability. And this was done for the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth. And it was presented, I think, in June or May 2020 at the United Nations Council on Science and Technology for Development. So in the next slide, can you go to the next slide? You can see the article that I wrote was on addressing the divide in accessibility to assistive technologies for persons with disabilities. Yeah, next slide. Next slide. Right. So assistive technology addressing the divide between the developed and developing world. This is what I wrote. And this article is available on their website. It's on the volume 16, issue 2, which is a special issue that I just showed you. And you can have a look at this article. So what I've basically done in this article is provided recommendations on how to address the gap which exists between developed countries and developing countries in accessing assistive technologies for people with disabilities. All right, so this is an example of an op-ed that if you're interested in writing and research, you could write something like this on something that interests you. Could you go back to the previous slide? So this is SFN's website. Actually, it's a screenshot from the website. So as you can see that the SFN has a lot of advocacy initiatives. So there's science funding, there's US advocacy, apply for advocacy training, global advocacy programs. Unfortunately, a lot of this might be, again, for people who are a little bit advanced in their scientific careers. It might be people who already have a PhD training or are graduate students at the moment. But I would say that there is no harm in you being aware of these so that you explore the website, you know what is there, and you are prepared in advance so that you have enough experience once you go into the field of science policy and advocacy. Next slide. Yeah. So I think that's all. I hope I've covered all the information that I wanted to. You can reach out to me through LinkedIn, Stuti Chakraborty. You can email me at the email address given, or you can even email us at outreach@stimulusNGO.org. Thank you so much for listening. And yes, I think I spoke a lot, but any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you so much for speaking. I guess something I was wondering about was, I know you said at the very beginning, you work in as an occupational therapist, and I was kind of just wondering, like, what were some challenging parts as working as a occupational therapist, or like, yeah, like what's something challenging about it, and what's something that you really enjoy doing?
Something that's challenging about it requires a lot of patience because you're working with people with chronic disabilities. It has a long-term impact. So because you're working in a hospital environment, you need to have a lot of resilience. You need to have a lot of patience because these are people who will take a long time to recover. And when there's an injury or insult to the brain, definitely the plasticity changes that occur. It is a slow process. They definitely do occur, but it is a slow process. And also takes a lot of I would say strength, because you're day in and day out, you're kind of working with them. There are times when they might not improve, there are times when they might improve, so the results are not guaranteed. It's not like curing a fever, or yeah, it's basically a very, very different process. It's a longer process. So I think one of the challenges is just being resilient when it comes to treating your patients. But I think that I work at a great place where I have a lot of resources available. If I were working in a more low income setting, it would have been even more difficult, specifically because there's a lot of stigma associated with disability. And that's one of the things that I've addressed in my paper and the op-ed that I just showed you. So that might be something that if you're interested in, you can take it up. And that that has a lot of policy related implications as well. So I think a lot of the challenges, especially working in a low income setting or a low income country, is to address the stigma associated with neurological disorders leading to disability. And so that becomes a challenging part when you're working as a medical professional or as a healthcare professional. But because I work in a setting which is tertiary care and there's quite a lot of advanced equipment and technology and a lot of advanced services available, so it's not really very difficult for me to navigate that path. But definitely working with people, because you're making such a huge difference in their lives, by working with them on a day-to-day basis, which is a slow process, a long process, takes a lot of patience. So that's one thing.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much. Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. So relating to your previous answer, you talked about in the previous in your talk, you talked about like how you were involved in advocacy for children with disabilities. So could you talk to us about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So through Stimulus, we've done some work on raising awareness about different conditions related to physical disabilities. So I personally, on a personal level, I have done a lot of sessions, mentorship sessions with different organizations, different schools, on making places more equitable, more accessible, and more equitable in terms of physical opportunities or physical environment to provide opportunities for children with disabilities. For example, a child with physical disability who is on a wheelchair would require a ramp to access and go to school. Unfortunately, not a lot of places in India actually have all these. There are a lot of physical and architectural barriers, not just in India, but in a lot of other countries as well. So that might prevent a child from going back to school, even though the child is cognitively all right. So that is a major physical barrier which is present in the environment. So it's not a problem with the child with the disability, it's actually a problem in the environment. And by law, any government institution or government office or public space that is government run is required to have ramps so that people with disabilities or physical disabilities can access them. So these are things that people are not aware of. So I have, on a personal level, I have done a lot of advocacy and mentorship with different schools, with different youth-led organizations, and I've done like similar discussions like this or sessions like this to educate people and make them aware about the rights of people and children with disabilities, and how to make curricula more accessible for children with specific learning disabilities, how to make environments more accessible for children with physical disabilities. I think I've done about 3 to 4 sessions, and these have all been like sessions which have wherein I've talked about the different barriers that are faced and how these barriers can be overcome with the help of the resources that are available. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much.
Does anybody else have any other questions? We can give
one thing I would like to add.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so one thing I would like to add is that we need a lot of people after, we see a lot of people like going into, after getting their PhD or finishing their graduate education, going into academic research, which is a great thing. But if you are seriously considering a career in neuroscience, I would definitely encourage you to think about science policy as a track. And I think now the trends are changing. A lot of people are becoming more aware and taking up science communication, career in industry, a career in science policy after pursuing their PhD. So people have stopped going into the general route of just going into academic research or becoming an independent investigator immediately after their PhD or their postdoc. So I think by the time you people are, going for your graduate studies in another few years, the scenario is going to change significantly. There's a lot of people that are working on raising awareness and communicating challenges regarding funding that is available. So one of the main things that is required for science to continue is funding. So to advocate for adequate funding is really, really important. There are a lot of areas in neuroscience research which is severely underfunded. For example, I am interested in stroke research, and stroke research is quite underfunded. Most of the research money, the diseases that are funded heavily are dementia, Alzheimer's. Some of the neuropsychiatric disorders are quite well funded, but there are still a lot of diseases that are very, very underfunded. So for example, like, you might have somebody in your family who has that particular disease, but then there isn't like really a substantial cure for it. There isn't some of there are a lot of infectious diseases that lead to neurological problems that do not really have a lot of research going on related to them, and they are severely underfunded. So maybe you could be the one like taking up advocating for it, or advocating for policy changes to increase funding for that particular condition. So you never know. It's always good to have baseline knowledge and search and look at where is the gap and try and address it. It doesn't matter how young or how old you are or what stage of your career you are in. Change can start at any time if you're interested.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree. Thank you so much for talking with us. I just wanted to point out something really quickly. In your slides, I saw that one of the sources was from Julian McCall, and she was actually one of our speakers here a couple months ago. And she talks about some of the similar things about like having scientists making policy. And I thought that was really interesting and kind of seeing that trend through our sessions. So that was really cool.
Right. That was great. I think I missed that session due to a time difference, but I would love to receive a recording.
Yeah, I'll see if I have one. Does anybody else have any questions? If not, we'll probably wrap it up here. It's been nearly an hour, so yeah, all right then. Thank you so much, Stuti. This was a really, really amazing and eye-opening session, and I learned definitely a lot. I'm sure everyone else did as well. But yeah, thank you guys all for coming, and a huge thank you to you for speaking with us. But yeah, thank you. Have a great rest of your day, and let us know if you ever need anything from us.
Sure, thank you. Feel free to reach out to me, email me in case you have questions later on, and I'm always happy to work with Simply Neuroscience. Thank
Yeah,
you. All the
so happy to
best.
have you. Bye.
Bye.